Oh, that was a tough one.
What session did you have?
Well, it was only 4 lots of 8 minutes at Sweetspot, but I just think my legs are still feeling that threshold session from earlier in the week.
Yeah, I know how you feel. I just finished my tempo run. I felt pretty good actually, but I'm kind of dreading the 30 minutes at threshold I have this weekend.
Oh, I don't blame you. Well, do you have no idea what we're on about right now? Well, fear not. We're here to clear up those blurred lines between Sweetspot, threshold and tempo once and for all. I expect you've heard of the terms sweet spot, threshold, tempo, used by fellow athletes and coaches when explaining the effort level and intensity of a training session. But do you know what the difference is between these? Well, a lot of people are guilty of using these terms interchangeably, so much so that when I was doing research for this video, I found a title saying Tempo Run Session, How to Find Your Sweet Spot. But this blurring can actually be explained by the fact that there is a very small difference between sweet spot, tempo and threshold. And with this video, I want to make it very clear that by the end of it, you can understand the difference in each, and most importantly, when you would use each intensity for your cycling or your running training. I've chosen to begin with the tempo session for a logical reason. It sits lowest of all three, just beneath sweet spot. But I would say the tempo session is probably the greyest of all the areas, both in its meaning, but also the way in which it's used by athletes and coaches in their terminology. When researching it, I came across it described as relatively hard yet sustainable, half marathon pace, conversational, or aerobic miles. Now, I would say they all sound pretty similar and probably fairly accurate, but I would just take out the half marathon running pace, as that is going to be so different for all of us. But I expect you want a little bit more data than that, a bit more factual information. So let's dive into the numbers. And when it comes to heart rate zones, it sits in zone 3, around 5 to 6 out of 10 for RPE or effort level. And it's a pace that should help you feel good, but it's not easy. You're just starting to push it. And realistically, you should be able to hold this pace for around 45 minutes. And I find a really good way to kind of judge or know if you're in the right zone is conversational aspects. If you're running with a fellow runner, you should be able to have a two-way conversation fairly comfortably. So you could use this run, say, a week before you've got a low-level race coming up, or you're maybe just getting back into your training. It's just a great way to tune your body and just remind your body what it feels like to run a bit quicker, but without taking very much out of you. So it's not that hard intensity. And a great example would be, say, a 50-minute run, and you just stick in the middle of that a 20-minute tempo effort. And it should leave you feeling just a little bit uplifted. Now, you've heard me talk pretty much just about running in this situation when referring to tempo, and that's not been a mistake. It's basically far more common to use this kind of effort level, but doesn't mean it can't translate to cycling. But I think in cycling, you're more likely to see training programs that have got a low-level aerobic, sort of steady bike ride, or sweet spot efforts, which actually will sit either side of zone 3. Let's step it up a notch, but only mildly. We're moving on to sweet spot. But first I need to dispel the myth. There is nothing sweet about this intensity, I'm afraid. I've heard it described as medium hard, slightly harder than tempo, or prioritizing quality over quantity. But if we take a closer look at the details, that translates as 84 to 97% of your FTP, or zone 3 into the bottom of zone 4, or 75 to 85% of your maximum heart rate, which would translate to around a 7 out of 10 on the effort level scale, which in practical terms would mean you could probably say just a few words at a time. Sweet spot training sessions are more commonly seen in cycling training programs, and they're designed to enable an athlete to really get the most out of that available time they have in a week. They're hard enough that you will see those gains, but not so hard that your body isn't going to need all week to recover. And as a result, you can actually fit several of these sessions into a week. Well, a typical sweet spot session could look something like this: 3 times 10 minutes at that intensity, followed by a 3-minute easy spin in between. Guess what? Threshold is harder than tempo and sweet spot, but it is most probably the most commonly used training terminology, and as a result, it's the best understood when it comes to its meaning and its use. It's often described as a mixture between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, a hard yet sustainable effort, race pace, or an effort that you could hold in training between 8 and 30 minutes, roughly. But that is very much for training, because in theory, threshold is the best effort you could sustain for an hour, whether that's the bike or the run. But when it comes to training, obviously you're not going to be so mentally prepared or physically rested, so a 30-minute effort is still going to take a lot out of your body. And with that in mind, you don't tend to do a threshold effort more than once a week usually. Okay, let's take a look at the numbers. Threshold falls into zone 4, an 8 to 9 out of 10 when it comes on the RPE scale, and really you should only be able to say the odd word when you're working at this intensity. In a race scenario, it would be similar to a 5 to 10k running race or a 20k TT, and you're really working at this top end. Well, a nice meaty threshold session example could look like this for the bike: 3 times 15 minutes with a 7-minute easy in between. Or if you were doing a running threshold session, then 3 lots of 8 minutes at this effort with a 3-minute jog recovery in between each. Now, it should be a little clearer as to the meaning of each term and what it should feel like in training, but when do you want to work at each effort level and why? Well, to dive a little deeper into this, I caught up with sports physiologist from Wahoo, Neil Henderson.
Well, thanks, Neil. My first question, and it is a big one, is when would you use the different intensities of sweet spot, of tempo, and of threshold in cycling and in running, and why?
Yeah, so in some way, all of those terms have a pretty similar and potentially even crossover. So it's really important to kind of delineate what you're saying with each of those zones, as you say. So tempo, sweet spot, and threshold. Generally speaking, tempo is a little bit of the lower of those 3 levels, and so there's different definitions. So the definitions we use, we have both an output for swimming, cycling, and running relative to what is a sustainable pace or threshold pace or power output. So in cycling, we use 76 to 89% of FTP for our tempo power intensity. When we think of running and swimming, I actually think of it in a mathematical term of 120 to 116% of run threshold pace, just because it's easy to do that math. If my threshold pace is a 5 minute per kilometer, 120% of that is a 6 minute per kilometer, and 110% of that is a 5.5 minute per kilometer pace. So that's just easier math. Same then for the swim, I use 117 to 105% of swim threshold pace. So again, if I swim a 2 minute per kilometer pace, then that would be at 5%, 105% of that would be a 212. I think if I'm doing the math in my head correctly.
I'm gonna just go with you on that one.
per 100 pace. And so we think of it both as output target as well as then a heart rate. So generally speaking, we think of things relative to our threshold heart rate rather than maximum heart rate. We just tend to use that as that threshold is variable. You know, it does occur between about 88 and 92% of max heart rate, and it is specific to the sport. So your run max and threshold heart rates are higher typically than cycling threshold and max heart rates, which then swim threshold and maximum heart rates tend to be even lower than that. All the different things of the amount of muscle mass being used, body position, being horizontal in the water, etc. So we use 88 to 95% of the sport specific threshold heart rate. So to define that tempo zone, we don't actually use the term sweet spot. It's just a finer gradation, which in a lot of cases, day-to-day variation in both heart rate, pace, and power are such that trying to get such an accurate to say, you know, between 90 and 92% is the right spot is not reality. We're not robots. Humans are living people, living creatures with some variation in day to day. So those ranges, we do believe a little bit larger range. When we think about then that threshold range, we do think about, again, just a little bit above and just a little bit below, because again, you have some day-to-day variation. What that threshold pace is not the same day in and day out. You never want to tattoo your FTP on your hand or your arm or anything, because it is a moving target a little bit. So we use a little bit of a flexible plus and minus about 5 to 10% then above where that threshold pace or power would be. And so generally speaking, tempo is an elevated effort above just general endurance. Your breathing rate is higher and your body is using more carbohydrate as fuel. That's one of the big shifts that's occurring. Your sympathetic nervous system is a little bit more engaged than it is when you're in that steady state general endurance intensity. And that threshold is really where you're at that near break point. From a lab test, we might call it a VT2 or other terms there. It's where lactate levels would rise rapidly if you increase the intensity above that break point. And so that also has some consequences, that you can only train or exercise so much above that threshold without fatiguing and without building up a lot of fatigue and needing more time to recover. So that tempo and general endurance, your body can recover from that more quickly than once we get up to that threshold, and especially above.
Okay, that's really clear, and it's really helped make a lot of sense, I think, to our viewers as well. But I've got a question which could be controversial from what you've just said, because earlier in the video I've talked about Sweetspot and how a lot of coaches, especially triathlon and cycling coaches, love the Sweetspot sessions. I mean, you can go on Zwift and you'll have workouts that are labeled Sweetspot, and it's used, I've never heard it used in running terms, but it's used a lot in cycling. Is that because you can be more specific with the power numbers and you've got more numbers that are more measurable? Or what's your take on when Sweetspot is used, having sort of slightly debunked it?
Yeah, I would say I think just people have gotten used to it. It's been pushed out there. People have talked about it. And so they kind of grab onto it. To me, it's just a term. It's nothing more than that. And it's not a magic term. There is no magic intensity that all kinds of miraculous things occur. There's a continuum of intensity that we have that we can exercise at. In cycling, again, yes, with the power meter, we have that degree of accuracy in being able to look at that number and target things with potentially a greater degree in terms of an ease of use than we've had, say, in swimming. Of course, swimming, we don't get that kind of feedback in the same way. Yes, there are some goggles that'll give you a little bit of pace, but I'm not sure exactly how that accuracy is. So we don't have the same degree of accuracy, especially in swimming. In running now, I'd say with a GPS watch, well, yeah, as I'm running along, I can see my pace and I can set it to be a percentage of a pace value and actually get the same degree of accuracy. I just would say that runners have less been on that cutting edge where we see with cycling. In cycling, it's a sport that uses a mechanical device, and we have then all these electronic things now that are come into it. And so in cycling, we're much more open to having that kind of additional level of analysis and scrutiny, where a lot of times in running, we have for sure individuals that do use some of those tools in running, but by and large, it's not the same utilization. You don't need technology in running as much that you do. A bicycle is a piece of technology as a starting point. So potentially, I think there's a little bit of a difference there. And it's just, again, in the cycling realm, that term sweet spot has been kind of latched on. And just like in endurance sports, people talking about 80-20 as being this, like, that's the only way to train that's useful. Well, I mean, yeah, there's some evidence that I can cherry pick some things that'll say, absolutely, yes, that's the way to do it. And I can also cherry pick some things that says, yeah, that doesn't really make sense. If I look at heart rate response and a lot of those things, well, heart rate lags. So it doesn't actually effectively measure short intensity efforts that are done. And if you have an athlete who has a heart rate monitor only, well, you're never going to catch some of that high intensity training that they're doing in certain types of on-off efforts. And so it'll never be reflected. And so, yeah, 80-20 looks good. But if we actually have something like a power meter on them or a GPS device, if we actually catch that high intensity work, now that distribution looks a little bit different. And it's just what you're measuring and how you're comparing it that can have a little bit of an impact. So Sweetspot doesn't create any magical physiologic responses, just like none of the others do. They all have certain levels of stress and strain associated, and there's a balancing act of how much and when in a given training cycle for a given athlete it's going to be best to use.
I think you've really kind of just brought together the fact that coaching and training is that combination of art and science. And, you know, we want the numbers, we want to see the black and white, and this is this zone, that is this zone, but it's not like that. And that's why I think coaching is so important. But yeah, I think you've summarized that really nicely. And hopefully, even though it is blurred lines, you've clarified those blurred lines.
Yeah. I mean, I am a sports scientist and I really love the numbers, but there's still an aspect to what we do in training, and especially when we race, that isn't exclusively dictated by those things. And so it's a great guide, it's useful, and it's important to be tracking and assessing and seeing where you're at over time. But there's really, there's always going to be that day-to-day variation and a little bit of, on occasion, geez, I mean, what happens if your battery dies on your power meter when you're in a race and you only have a target based on, some power number? Oh my gosh, can you evaluate how hard you're working based on your perceived effort? Do you have a good in tune with your body? What's your breathing rate? Have you actually used those other things and ways of evaluating? I know one of my best ever time trial races, power meter didn't pick up, but I had heart rate and cadence. I was like, all right, well, there we go. I got two things that I know. 92 RPM is pretty much in that sweet spot for me. And my breathing rate, I could manage the effort by looking at the heart rate and feeling my breathing rate and looking at cadence without power. And I went faster than I ever had on that course. So.
Well, you've made a great point, and I like the fact that you've alluded to that, because you've kind of rounded up this chat quite nicely, because we have included and talked about the RPE and the breathing rate for these different zones and where you're working. So I think that, it sort of explains that we don't need to rely entirely on numbers. Even though you are a sports physiologist and sports scientist, I think you've really brought that together. So thank you so much for your time and your knowledge, Neil.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, a big thank you to Neil for delving into the detail around that. Hopefully now you've got a clear understanding of the pros and cons and when you might want to use these various intensities. But a very quick summary, I would recommend using tempo effort when you want to feel good and you want to help build your body's ability to work efficiently in an aerobic capacity. Then you've got your sweet spot, which is perfect for on the bike, of being time efficient and just boosting that fitness, especially useful in pre-season. And finally, threshold, that's when you're gonna be working really hard. You're gonna get a lot of fitness gains, but it does take your body longer to recover from it, so you need to respect those sessions. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed this video and it's given you some clarity. Give us a like if so, and remember, you can always hit that globe and subscribe.